I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report.
MASH, a chronic and progressive form of fatty liver disease that until recently was known as NASH, affects millions of people in the United States, and its incidence continues to rise. In fact, MASH is now among the leading causes of liver transplantation in the United States. 89bio is developing an experimental therapy to target multiple disease mechanisms of the condition. We spoke to Rohan Palekar, CEO of 89bio, about what's driving the prevalence of MASH, the limits of existing medicines, and how its experimental therapy targets both liver fibrosis and the underlying metabolic dysfunctions of the disease. Since recording this interview, Roche announced it would acquire 89bio for $14.50 a share and a contingent value right of $6 per share for up to a total of $3.5 billion. Rohan, thanks for joining us.
Dan, thanks for having me on the show.
We're going to talk about liver disease known as MASH, 89bio, and its efforts to develop a treatment for an advanced form of this serious liver disease. Until 2023, this was known as NASH, but it's now referred to as MASH. What is MASH?
So what MASH stands for, just the acronym, it stands for Metabolic Dysfunction Associated Steatotic Liver Disease. Okay, that's a handful. But here's what it is. It's a chronic and progressive condition of the liver, and it represents a severe form of metabolic dysregulation fatty liver disease. So at its core, what happens in this disease is fat starts accumulating in the liver, and as it continues to build up in some patients, this progresses to get inflamed, and then over time it becomes fibrotic, which is a really bad condition. And then in the worst case scenarios, some of these patients progress to what's called cirrhosis, where your liver is really scarred. And what's interesting, Stan, is not everyone will progress. So a lot of people will have fatty liver disease today, or MASLD as it's called, but about a third of them will end up with this more severe disease state called MASH. And then the other thing which is important when you think about MASH is these patients have a lot of other cardiometabolic comorbidities or conditions. So very high prevalence of type 2 diabetes in these patients. A lot of them have obesity, and a lot of them have lipid dysregulation. If I just take diabetes, there was a recent publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, which I think had close to about a third of patients with type 2 diabetes also probably have MASH. So it's a pretty prevalent condition, and it progresses over time. And in the early stages, it can take a lot of time to progress. And then, some people will have the disease for 15 and 20 years.
Well, how do people normally get diagnosed with it? Is it a physician seeing these comorbidities and deciding to do some kind of testing, or are there symptoms that lead someone to see a doctor before it's progressed too far where it's actually something like cirrhosis?
Yeah. So this is one of the biggest challenges, because in the earlier stages of the disease, most of these people with MASH have very few, and arguably many have no symptoms. And it becomes more symptomatic in the later stages of the disease. And so as a result, very often patients go undetected for many years. In fact, it could be for 10 years, 15 years. So to answer your question, the most common way, look, if it has got progressed to that state, and if you're cirrhotic, you have multiple other complications, and you present to a doctor. But more often than not, the way it gets diagnosed is I go in for my routine checkup, I do my blood work, and my liver transaminases are elevated. And so the physician looks at it, says, okay, you're diabetic, you're obese, and we cannot explain why your liver, your liver function test, like those are out of control. I might refer you to a gastroenterologist or a hepatologist. And that's typically where it then gets officially diagnosed. One thing what those people do is, so if you think about it from a regulatory perspective, the official diagnosis has to be done with a biopsy. In the real world, no one does that. Biopsies are invasive, it's painful, there's a lot of issues. And no one likes a big needle being stuck into their liver. But so what these physicians tend to do for diagnosis, at least in the gastroenterologist or hepatology offices, they would do like an ultrasound test where they measure how much fat's in your liver and how elastic your liver is. And using the elasticity is kind of a proxy for, is your liver getting scarred and fibrotic? So that's kind of typically the pathway and the diagnosis, for the disease state as it exists today.
And what's known about the underlying cause?
So it's unclear. It can't be pegged to one specific thing. So as I mentioned, a lot of these patients have diabetes, obesity. And when you think about what is MASH, right, as I mentioned earlier, it's when too much fat builds up in the liver and then causes inflammation. And so it's very often related to how your body is processing fats and sugar. So one of the causes you'll see is diet and lifestyle. And it's one of the reasons you're seeing an increasing number of patients being diagnosed with MASH. But things like obesity are very closely correlated with MASH. Things like type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, because your body cannot break down your fats. And then that fat gets deposited into the liver. And after some point in time, the liver can't process all the fats. There are some genetic markers in some patients, but it's not the predominant reason why people end up with MASH.
There's been a stunning increase in the number of younger adults with MASH since 1990. How big a health problem does this represent today, and what accounts for the sharp increase in cases? Is it just the growing number of people who are obese?
Yeah, so it is a very significant health problem, which is underestimated and underdiagnosed, right? And a lot goes back to because it's asymptomatic, it doesn't get diagnosed. And the reason it's a significant health problem is because if untreated, these patients progress to really further stages of fibrosis and potentially cirrhosis, which is highly problematic, has very significant healthcare burden on the patient and the system in place. So today, now, MASH is one of the leading causes of liver transplantation in the United States. So these patients progress over time and you don't intervene, you could end up. It also could result in hepatocellular carcinomas. So it's pretty bad and a pretty significant health problem. Now, when you think about the number of patients, there's a study which talked about by 2030, we could have close to 27 million Americans with MASH, of which about 7.5 to 8 million are with advanced fibrosis. That's a pretty large number. To answer your second part of it, yes, I think one of the biggest drivers of the increase is the increase in diabetes, the increase in obesity, and many will attribute that to changes in diet and lifestyles.
There are now 2 approved drugs for MASH, the oral thyroid hormone receptor beta agonist resmetirom, which the FDA approved in 2024, and now the injectable GLP-1 receptor agonist Wegovy. How effective are these therapies?
Let me start by saying first, I am really happy that drugs have got over the finish line and now we have approved medicines for the treatment of MASH. Patients needed therapies. It's been a long time coming, and it's wonderful to have these 2 drugs approved, right? Because there was nothing otherwise available for them. the standard response they got from their clinician was diet and lifestyle. Here's how I would describe both these drugs. I think both these treatments have shown, I'd say, moderate effects on the most important marker of MASH progression, which is fibrosis. So fibrosis is what causes the most negative outcomes and results in people becoming cirrhotic. And both these drugs have shown benefits, but I would say they are moderate. So for example, resmetirom showed on a placebo-adjusted basis about a 10 to 12% benefit, and semaglutide, which is the drug in Wegovy, was about 14%. So there are some patients who respond, but there are a number of patients who don't respond to these therapies, and that's why there still is a pretty big need for better therapies, and especially for therapies to treat the advanced fibrosis. I think the other thing I would say when you think about treatment options for these patients, none of these drugs, then, including our drug, we're not curing the disease. We're improving the disease. And so it might be a category where there will be combinations of drugs used to actually get a better impact relative to what these two approved drugs today have. So you might have someone already taking a GLP receptor antagonist like Wegovy, but they're not fully seeing the whole benefits or they're not responding, and you need to add a second drug on top of that first one.
Well, how would you think about the unmet need?
So the biggest unmet need where there's the greatest burden of the disease is these patients with advanced fibrosis and cirrhosis. So I should have mentioned the fibrosis gets staged in 4 stages. It's called F0, F1, F2, F3, and then F4 is the same as cirrhosis. So it's those patients with the advanced fibrosis, the F3s and F4s, who have a lot of bad outcomes. That's where the biggest unmet need resides, and especially in that F4 cirrhosis population. So for example, the drug in Wegovy, semaglutide, was tested in F4 and did not see a benefit. So it's got approved by the FDA for F2 and F3 disease, and same with resmetirom. So that clearly is the highest unmet need is the cirrhosis patients. And then there's a second group, which is what I call the high-risk group. So these are patients who have advanced fibrosis, but also have multiple comorbidities. So they have cardiovascular comorbidities, they have high lipid levels, high triglycerides. And those patients need better therapies to address not just their MASH, but also what's happening in their cardiometabolic profile. And the reason this is important is because a lot of MASH patients, in fact, the majority of MASH patients, at the end of the day, they succumb to their cardiovascular events. There's a pretty strong link between renal, liver, and cardiometabolic health. And so these patients who already are at high risk of cardiometabolic risk because of their CV factors and then get MASH, they actually are people who really need a better therapeutic option.
Your lead experimental therapy is pegozafermin. What is this and how does it work?
Sure. So pegozafermin is a FGF21 analog, which we are developing for the treatment of MASH as well as cardiometabolic diseases. So what is FGF21? FGF21 is a metabolic hormone, which is found in the body. It's an endogenous metabolic hormone. And this hormone is produced in the liver. And it acts on the liver, but it also acts throughout the body to control energy, glucose metabolism, energy metabolism, lipids, as well as insulin sensitizing. It's an insulin sensitizing agent. Okay. So if you think about from a mechanistic perspective, what it does is in the liver, it has been shown it reduces liver fat. It defats the liver. It prevents new fat from being generated in the liver, what's called de novo lipogenesis. But then importantly, it also has a direct effect on the fibrotic pathways in the liver. So it has a direct effect on the liver. But as I mentioned, it also works outside the liver. And here what it does is it improves insulin sensitivity, it reduces lipids in the bloodstream, so like triglycerides in the bloodstream. And by doing things like that, what it does is it prevents more fat from being deposited in the liver. So it's kind of got two ways how this metabolic hormone works for the treatment of MASH. Now, the challenge is in the native state in the body, you have very low levels of FGF21. And the other issue is the half-life of FGF21 is really short. It's less than 2 hours. So what pegozafermin is a molecule we developed, we engineered it to recapitulate the activity of native FGF21, but we allow it to stay in the bloodstream for much longer time period. And we do this with a unique glycopegylation technology. And so what it does is it gives it a lot more FGF21 than your body is normally producing. It stays in your bloodstream much longer, and it allows it to address the liver fibrosis, but also improve the overall cardiometabolic health and thereby downstream improve the liver.
And what's known about its safety and efficacy from studies you've done to date?
Yes, so we have done three studies actually, but I'm going to talk about, we did a very large phase 2b study, which read out about 2 years ago, subsequently was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was a study in 220 patients, roughly 220 patients who all had MASH with fibrosis stage 2 or stage 3, so relatively advanced. And what we observed is, from an efficacy perspective, we were able to show in as short a time period as 24 weeks, we were able to show a very robust improvement in their fibrosis stage. So a lot of the F2 patients went to F1, F3 went either to F2 or F1. And when we compare this across multiple other MASH trials, and it's always a little tricky to do cross-trial comparisons, but we looked at, we didn't, there was actually a publication which looked at 29 different MASH studies. And what it showed is that pegozafermin looked like it had the best fibrosis improvement relative to placebo. We also
Does that suggest it's actually reversing the disease?
So, yes, it is in those patients. So we're seeing in approximately over 20% on a placebo-adjusted basis, where we are actually reversing the disease. In other patients, we're slowing down them progressing. So we were preventing a fair number of patients from going from F3 disease to cirrhosis. And this all was done then in 24 weeks. Now, our ongoing studies are much longer phase 3 studies, and we think over a longer time period, we think we could actually have an even better impact. And the reason I say that is, you can improve all these other things. You can take fat out of the liver, you can improve the lipids, etc. But it takes a while to kind of break down the fibrotic matrix and let the liver reheal. So in 6 months to see that was pretty remarkable. And we think in the longer studies, which are a year and 2 year long studies, we could see greater benefit. The reason we feel that is because in addition to fibrosis, that's the one endpoint, which was the primary endpoint I'm talking about, we saw very nice changes. We defat the liver like 50 to 60% of liver fat we take out. We saw nice changes on all the lipid markers. We saw benefits on glycemic control or hemoglobin A1C and things like triglycerides. So that's kind of when you take away all those injuries and insults, we feel over time, because liver is one of those organs which can regenerate, we think over a longer time period, the benefits could be even greater.
You talked earlier about your expectation that you would see treatment of this condition moving towards combinations of therapies. Are you developing this as a monotherapy, or are you testing it in combination with anything?
Sure. So currently we have 2 large phase 3 studies ongoing. So one is a phase 3 study, what we call enlightened fibrosis, which is in the non-cirrhotic patients. So this is in patients with F2 and F3 fibrosis disease. And then we have a separate study, which we call enlightened cirrhosis, which is a study in F4 patients, cirrhotic patients. And both these studies are set up in a way where we can get, you enroll patients in the pre-cirrhotic study, you treat them for 1 year, you do a repeat biopsy. If you show a benefit, you can then file for approval for what's called accelerated approval in the US and in Europe. And in the cirrhosis study, we treat them for 2 years before doing a repeat biopsy. And then we continue all these patients to see long-term outcomes. To answer your specific question, we allow patients to come in on stable doses of other drugs. So we think the sweet spot for our therapy is those advanced patients. We think the GLP-1s, for example, they're going to be used earlier in the treatment paradigm, where their purpose is more about a metabolic benefit versus a fibrotic benefit. So we actually allow patients to come in on GLP-1s. We have shown in our study, which we completed, we already showed really good results on top of a GLP-1 receptor agonist. So we think that could be something in the real world, how patients will use the drug. They're taking their Wegovys, they're taking their Ozempics, whichever drug they're on, but their MASH is progressing, and they need something more potent like an FGF21, and that's where pegozafermin would make a lot of sense.
You're also developing pegozafermin as a treatment for severe hypertriglyceridemia. This is a rare condition that's asymptomatic, but can have quite serious consequences. What is it?
Sure. So SHTG is very high levels of triglycerides in the blood, so essentially a lot of fat in the blood. So normal triglycerides is anything below 150 mg per deciliter. Elevated is about 150 or 200. Severe hypertriglyceridemia is patients who consistently have triglycerides above 500 mg per deciliter, so really high levels. You mentioned it's a rare condition, and this is kind of where, in some ways, there's a little bit of confusion in the field. It actually is not that rare. There's nearly 3.5 to 4 million patients today in the United States with SHTG. Of those, about 1.8 million are diagnosed. So it is diagnosed. I think what happens is, because triglycerides fluctuate, and physicians also, they can treat it. There are drugs available to treat it. They tend to focus more, honestly, on LDL management versus triglyceride management for cardiovascular health. But now, I think the world is getting more aware of the fact that where you have persistent triglyceride elevations in the bloodstream, it can result in pretty significant downstream issues, because this additional fat gets deposited in the liver and the pancreas. You end up with greater incidences of acute pancreatitis. It has implications on the heart and the muscle. So it is becoming more and more coming to the forefront for managing overall cardiovascular health, I'll say.
What treatment options exist today?
So there are a couple of drugs which have been approved. The two main classes of drugs approved, one is the class of fish oils, and the other is a class of drugs called fibrates. Interestingly, statins have not been approved for it, but statins have been shown to have a benefit at high doses, and some people use it. The challenge with these drugs is they modestly reduce triglyceride levels, especially the fish oils. They'll reduce your triglyceride levels by 25, 27, 30%. Fibrates and statins, you have to use at high doses, but then you have tolerability issues with those drugs. And the other challenge is, just like in MASH, these SHTG patients have a lot of comorbidities. Most of these SHTG patients have very high liver fat, liver challenges, and about 2/3 are either pre-diabetic or diabetes. And none of these drugs, whether it's fibrates, whether it's fish oils, or whether it's statins, address some of those other metabolic challenges. So that's kind of been One class of drugs, relatively safe, the fish oils, but not great on efficacy. Fibrates, a little better on efficacy, but a lot of challenges from a tolerability and safety perspective.
And what's known about pegozafermin in SHTG?
Sure. So we did a phase 2 study where we showed really nice benefits on reducing triglycerides in these patients with triglycerides above 500 mg. So for perspective, we saw between 57 and 63% reduction in triglycerides from baseline in as short as an 8-week time period. The drug was well tolerated, no safety issues. And then importantly, we also saw benefits on things like liver fat, improving their liver health, as well as all their lipids. And this is where we think the difference versus the existing classes of drugs is that pegozafermin not only works on the liver, not only works on the triglycerides, but also works on a lot of these comorbidities.
What's the development path forward?
So we have an ongoing phase 3 study, which is projected to read out in the first quarter of next year. And if that study is positive, we would embark on a second phase 3 study, which would be required for full approval in the United States. So we're looking forward to seeing the results from that study.
The company has a strong cash position. It had $561 million in cash at the end of June. How far will existing cash take you?
So the cash takes us obviously through the results next year in the SHTG program and into 27. Our MASH programs, because they're much longer studies, will read out sometime in that time period. But over time, we would need to raise additional capital to give us runway through the histology or through the readouts of the MASH studies.
And do you expect to build your own commercial organization, or will you be seeking to find a partner to do that?
It's a good question. So we are planning on building a commercial organization. You always plan for that because when we set up the company, at the end of the day, our goal was to bring this therapy to help patients. So we're doing a lot of the groundwork for that. We have a small team, both medical affairs team in the field and a small team in the home office working on that. But we remain open to evaluating partnerships on our programs. We recognize that there are millions of patients with MASH. It's going to require a pretty large presence from a commercial perspective. And if we find the right partner, we remain open to that, and especially in the OUS market. So our commercial activities today, Dan, are predominantly focused in the United States. But we realize there are MASH patients all over the globe. And in some other parts of the world, a partner might be better served to really optimize the opportunity for patients than we could do it.
Rohan Palekar, CEO of 89 Bio. Rohan, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.